has been a very serious series of problems relating to institutional failures. If you think of institutional failures, and I mean, I'm sorry to sort of twist the knife, but you can see that often that the church, for example, has been, because of the the nature of the Royal Commission on Institutional Child Abuse, you can see a whole number of horror stories coming out from the churches and some other related organisations dealing with young people, including, say, the Salvation Army, not just by any means, not just the Catholic Church. But you can see that in many institutions which have been revered and which have been held up on a pedestal, that the nature of the problems are really terrible. You then realise that even institutions that we don't think of, where the moral issues come up, you can see that the way in which, say, the two major supermarket chains, the Coles and Woolworths supermarket chains, are operating, has been often extremely unethical. And you can see, of course, there are problems within the trade unions. Of course, there are problems within both political parties. Of course, there are problems inside the way in which the property industry operates. You can see that there's been a long and very disturbing history of brutality, sometimes even sadism, within some sections of the armed forces. Recently, we would have thought that the public service was free of it, but the revelations, for example, about the Victorian Education Department have been absolutely horrific to indicate the degree of corruption. And again, you wonder if you were to set up a Royal Commission or set up an inquiry into some area, you may find that there are other organisations that you regard as being above reproach in some way, where activities are acting really very badly. Sporting clubs, the whole problem of the use of supplements and so on, and other drugs has been a matter of grave concern. There's an increasing amount of corruption in the system just below the surface, and of course we don't talk about it because both political parties are conscious that they don't want too much exposed. You can see that in a whole number of areas, and I mean, if you take a very sensitive issue, it's a very sensitive issue in South Australia, the question of the building of the submarines, for example. But the quality of debate about the number of submarines has been appalling, because you say, well, how many submarines do we need? You say, is it 12? 12? Why not 13? Why not 11? You see, and every number that you make has an implication that involves billions of dollars that could keep a university or two afloat. But there's never been any discussion about it, because as soon as the government says, well, we think the magic number is 12, then the opposition says, oh, we don't want to be wedged on an issue like defence. So the result is that if we were to say, yes, there ought to be one more submarine or two more submarines, then that has taxation implications, and therefore we want to back away from that. And if we say, no, 12 is too many, we really only need 11. But they simply won't tackle it. And of course, the other thing that one of the wicked problems has been the absolute failure to, and we accept the retreat going on at the moment may lead to some kind of epiphany which changes everything. One might hope, because you can't get a resolution of the issue about whether the way in which you tackle a budget deficit by emphasising cuts, or by emphasising asset sales, or by borrowing, while at the same time simply ignoring ignoring revenue. So, for example, tax adjustments. So there are inbuilt tensions, I think, between the nature of our major challenges and attempt to understand them or attempt to address them. So, what you can say is about the wicked problems is that they are all long-term issues. They're all long-term issues, and they can't just be dealt with overnight. But our political cycles, certainly at the Commonwealth level, are really very short. 3-year parliaments for the Commonwealth, and then, as I say, 3 or 4 years for the states. And then the other complication is, of course, that media cycles are very long, are very short term. They're very often news editors get very tired of a story after 24 hours or so, so that you don't get the idea of saying, well, that's an interesting issue. Let's talk about it next week or the week after, because you have an increasing sense now that a lot of issues, I mean, Bronwyn Bishop and the helicopters notwithstanding, often issues will simply disappear after 20, and they say, look, that was yesterday's story. We're not interested in that anymore. Let's just go on with something else. And then perhaps the other factor, particularly where younger people are concerned, and these days I think of anyone under 75 as being a younger person, the social media, of course, the time frame involved in that is really very short, often time measured in minutes, if not indeed in seconds. Now, a major mistake, I might have to say this is the greatest single error that I made in Sleeper's Wake. There weren't all that many, but the greatest single error was I took the assumption that the role of the information technology revolution, that the IT revolution would empower people to such an extent that suddenly they'd be stretching out for the universal. You know, that they'd be really looking at, they'd be contemptuous of small scale, of localized problems. They'd really be reaching out to try and understand the universal. Well, that simply hasn't happened. To quite a dramatic degree, the role of IT technology, particularly the smartphone, have really reinforced the realm of the personal, and the role of the immediate, and also often the role of with the concentration on family, close friends, and people who think the same way. You can see that it's very interesting that where you've had a whole series of these incidents overseas where people have gone on a shooting rampage, you can see that typically they're all people who've been very active in the use of social media, and they're finding like-minded people who say, yes, we don't like the way the system operates either. And and I think you could argue that the iPhone has changed social relations perhaps more than any other single technology, perhaps even the car. And I think to a lot of people it's become the new best friend. The last thing seen and touched at night, the first thing seen and touched in the morning. I saw the citation alludes me, but I saw a reference somewhere that said that people on the whole touch their iPhones about 300 times a day, and the significant other about 12 times a day. Now you can draw whatever conclusion you like from that, assuming it is right. And it sounds to me as if it could well be. It could well be right. So I think it's had the effect, depressingly, had the effect of reducing that sense of empathy, sympathy for the other. And you can see that one of the reasons why the debate about asylum seekers has been so appalling has been that so much of the reaction, against the refugees hasn't just been hostile. That's too cautious a word. It's absolutely full of loathing, and that, you know, it's clear from some of the polling indicate they simply want to kill them. And if they drown at sea, well, too bad. Too bad. Don't expect any sympathy. And that, I think, is one of the most disturbing things. And of course, it's compounded by the fact that you can't get a serious debate. Certainly not at the national level politically. You can't get a serious debate on the issue. Oh, look, time is getting on, but you won't want me to go on forever, but I'll stop in a few minutes. Let me just jump ahead. In the last few months, I've had an interesting relationship that developed with Malcolm Fraser. Now, Malcolm was, I mean, I got to know Malcolm well, not really in the Parliament. I mean, I had a very remote relationship when he was in the Parliament, although I must say it was closer than some of his ministers had. But I was on the board of CARE Australia for 8 years when he was the chair, and ultimately I stayed on the board for just on 20 years. But anyway, so I got to know Malcolm very well then. And you can see that Malcolm was, as he developed, as he aged, contrary to what happens with so many people, his positions became increasingly radical. And he had a sense of outrage about the failure to deal with some of these very important issues like climate change, like asylum seekers, like taxation, and so on. And Malcolm's great dream, which he was working on right up until his death, was the idea of saying, look, there ought to be another political grouping, another political party for which people would identify, because it had in common that it was prepared to take on a whole series of courageous issues and fight for them. Well, I won't, again, if you like, I can give Lynn perhaps the text of what I've written here. But I worked out a list of about 30 issues in which I divided up policy reactions to issues in 3 columns. One column was the coalition position, then the ALP position, and then what you might loosely describe as the Courage Party. I mean, I didn't name it, but just call it the Courage Party. And you could see that if you went down that list, you could see that in many cases, well, to a very large extent, you could see that Labor and the coalition were 2 wings of the same bird. And that they certainly weren't prepared to. They certainly weren't prepared to fight, particularly on an issue which they thought was controversial. This is why it was so ironic when part of the reaction when Gough died was that people remembered, I mean, a lot of them geriatrics, but people remembered the time when if Gough had an issue, he'd go on and talk about it for months. You know, I don't see how he could fit in with the current media cycle, but he'd keep on going and going and going. And whereas now, you know, you've just got to get two or three key points and then just move on, and there's no serious discussion. So the result is we've simply lost the capacity to have that reasoned debate. And of course, related to it as well, of course, is the complete failure of education. Oh, sorry, complete failure of language in the political scene. You know, and in the Senate, you find now that people, Prime Minister, for example, as dealing simply in mantras. He'll find a phrase or two, a phrase or two in which you repeat, and so on. And the idea of having a system, and one of the reasons they hate Malcolm Turnbull is he uses verbs all the time. And I remember telling this story to someone. Somebody came up later and said, "What is a verb?" It's true. I mean, it's a sign of my age that I refer to grammar. But so the result is that you've got this that you'll find somebody like well, the treasurer says, "I'm not a quitter. I am not a quitter. Nobody's going to call me a quitter." After a while, you get or the Prime Minister says, "I'm a fighter. I'm a fighter. I'm a fighter." And so on. But you think, this is the paradox. Anyone care to guess how many graduates there are in Australia? Do you know?
No idea. 8 million?
Oh, turn it up. No, not even no when you were. No, it's 4.5 million. Mm-hmm. But still, 4.5 million is a hell of a lot. I mean, you've got 1 million blue-collar workers, mm-hmm. and you've got 4.5 million graduates in Australia. But at any given time, the number of people doing postgraduate and undergraduate work in universities is just over 1 million at the moment. Now you think that ought to mean that the level of political discourse is at an unprecedented level. Well, it isn't. It isn't. You can almost argue that there's an inverse relationship. And that's, I think, that people are simply concerned with that short-term, that comparatively short-term view. Well, look, some people want to go, no doubt, at 4 o'clock, if not before, and I haven't given you time for questions, which has been very ungenerous. So perhaps we might just leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks very much, Matt.